So here's lesson 10, and we're going to be talking about navigation. And so I sort of hinted at this last week, but that was 2 weeks ago before spring break. And so let's just take a look and explore further. So how do we organize when we have a lot of views, right? Especially when those views multiply and you have larger projects and you have a lot of views. Well, there's a couple of ways to do this, right? There's scenes, windows, navigation, as well as modal presentation and toolbars. Toolbars are often along the top of the screen, and they really just, help facilitate these other things. Scenes and windows are primarily for Mac applications, multiple windows. They can be used, though, on modern iPad applications because you can have multiple windows, either with Stage Manager or other split screen views. Today, though, we're just going to focus on navigation and the different ways to implement navigation. And there are three main ways to do that. One is tab view, then there's something called NavigationStack and NavigationSplitView. Now I want to reiterate, so far in your homework, you guys have used tab view, and that's also what I've used in examples in class. Now the landmarks Apple example that you worked with, they had something called navigation view, which has now been deprecated, which means it's on the process of being replaced. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I do want to emphasize what we're going to talk about today with NavigationStack and SplitView is not required for your homework, right? Your homework application is quite simple. There isn't this kind of nested navigation that's needed, which is why you only need a tab view. However, as you grow and build other apps, you certainly may want navigation, which is why I wanted to cover the topic. Also, maybe for your final projects, which are coming up, you may want to do this. But I'm sorry if there was, confusion with the past homework assignment, but there was no need to use navigation view, stack, or split view in those homework. The only one that was required was tab view at that time. But now we'll look at, okay, if we do want to implement this. So just a reminder, all this information is for your benefit and for the final project, but it is not required for your homework. So with this refactoring assignment, you don't need anything from this lecture. This is for, other knowledge. So there's three main navigation topics that I want to cover today. The first is how navigation view is being deprecated, right? It is no longer the recommended way, and it will be replaced. In a future version, you will not even be able to use it. It will no longer exist of Apple, software, iOS, macOS. And it's being replaced with something called NavigationStack and NavigationSplitView. So we're going to talk about that and how those things work. Then we're going to talk about something called programmatic navigation. I'm only going to briefly discuss this. It'll be more of an introduction because it's more advanced, but just so you're aware of its existence. And then we'll talk a little bit about modeling your data. And so how do you model the data to then take advantage of something like navigation, split view, and organizing and things like that. And also when to use protocols. I talked about protocols more in the beginning of class, and I saw some of you use them. And again, protocols is good to understand. It's not required for your homework because the data model is so simple. But protocols are useful when your data model is more complicated, more complex, which in your final projects you may want to use, but it's up to you. So I will be talking a little bit more about that, hopefully to provide clarity on when to use them and when not to use them as part of your data model, right? So when to use protocol as compared to a struct is what I mean when modeling your data. Because obviously, to use SwiftUI at all, right, we are using protocols that Apple has created. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you create your own protocols as part of your data model versus your own struct, your data model. Okay, So navigation, there's something called navigation view, and it worked with one or multiple columns. And Apple introduced this in the very first version of SwiftUI, and now that we're on the third iteration, they've decided that that is not the best approach. And so they are replacing it. It will not be available in the next version of iOS, macOS. And so instead, the one navigation view, they actually replaced with two different kinds of views. It's called NavigationStack and NavigationSplitView. And so you can see NavigationStack is just for one column. NavigationSplitView is just for multiple columns. And what this does is it just makes everything more clear. Because when everything was a navigation view in the beginning, it actually became quite cumbersome on how you decided whether it was one or multiple columns. So it seemed like a good idea, I'm sure at the time, for them to use one view, but in practice, it was more complicated. And so they split it out. So now we know that if we're using a navigation stack, that's always only going to be one column. And we know if we use a navigation split view, it's always going to be multiple columns. What is interesting, because navigation split view supports multiple columns, you can put a navigation stack inside of a navigation split view. That's a more complicated use case, so I'm not going to discuss that, but that is possible in case you see that later in your programming. So what is a navigation stack? Well, it's simply a stack of things that allows a little bit of navigation. So in this case, we have a list of Pokemon, right? And this is exactly like your homework. You have a list of things. Now in your homework, because it was made to look like Instagram, each row took up the whole screen, but it's the same idea. In this case, the rows are much smaller. We can see Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, etc. But it's the same idea. Whether the row is big or small, you have a row of things. Now what makes this different than your homework and different from Sologram is this idea of navigation. The idea is that if I tap on Bulbasaur at the top, we see this arrow, it's going to load another screen, and now we see this detail view, which happens to be this big full screen view of Bulbasaur, which you had maybe seen right in the previous Pokemon example. So now this sort of full image I have moved into what's called the detail view, and I have the smaller view for the row. And the way that, so if I tap on any one of these rows, whether it's the top one or the bottom one, right, whether it's Bulbasaur or Squirtle or whatever, so the way for it to load the correct view on the right-hand side detail view is the navigation stack. It's the navigation stack that handles that navigation. So remember, the list is what actually handles the list of things. The navigation stack is just what is like the glue between the list and to the detail view. So far in your homework and previous examples, there have been no detail views. It's just a list of things. That list may have been a bigger square for Instagram, right? But that was it. You couldn't tap any further. Now we have this idea of a detail view. So that's where the navigation stack comes into play. So what about on an iPad or a Mac? Well, the navigation stack is just one column, right? It's one list of things. So here I have an iPad landscape mode, which also is kind of how a Mac will respond, similar window size. And you can see it's still just one giant list. It fills the width. And if we tap on Bulbasaur, we get a giant detail view that fills the screen. So this is how navigation stack works. It's always going to fill whatever size, view you put it inside of. So you can imagine that works well on the iPhone, but it may not be the best on a Mac or an iPad. So this is where navigation split view comes into play. There's two reasons to use navigation split view. One is using the screen space, which we'll talk about, but the other, what we show on this screen, is organizing your data. So before, I just had a list of all the Pokemon sort of, jumbled together. But now we actually have our Pokemon organized. So now with a navigation split view, we have multiple columns, But on an iPhone, you only see them one at a time. So the first screen you'll see on the left, you'll just see the types: grass, fire, water, electric. If you tap on grass, for example, we only show the grass Pokemon. We see that there are 2 of them. Tap on Bulbasaur, then we get the same detail view. So you can see on the iPhone, it is multiple columns, but you only see one column at a time. This can still be useful because it can help you organize your data. Now on an iPad or a Mac, this becomes useful for 2 reasons. One, you can organize your data. Here we see types again, and we have grass and detail view. But you also notice this is just one screen. There's not so much tapping back and forth. We see it's using the larger screen of the iPad or the Mac much more effectively. And so now we actually see multiple columns at the same time. So what's really cool about a navigation split view is you can use that container and it just works. It does the right thing on the iPhone and it does the right thing on the iPad or the Mac. So this is often a good way to start your application. You'll notice many Apple apps use this. For example, the Apple Notes app, the Apple Mail app, and many others. So this is a good way to use the screen space effectively on your small device like an iPhone, and also a big device like an iPad or Mac. And it's a good way to organize your data. So let's look at the code to make this work in a little more detail on the data, the model that I was talking about, and how we organize. So here we have a basic list, right? This is just like what you've done in your homework for Solargram and what the sort of stacks applications look like in the past. We have a list object. We have some kind of data that's been given to us from a view model, but this is an array of data. And then from that array, it spits out one at a time, one object, right? This is one post from the array of posts. And then from that one object, we define a row. This is a view that I created. We pass the data inside that row. And so you only need one row, and it can be multiplied as many times as the data is in this array of posts. So this is how you just define the row once inside of the list, and it can create a view like this on the right, where we have many objects, because these are the objects that are in our array of data. That's very SwiftUI, right? We declare our interface, it's a list and a row, and it reflects whatever is in the data. In this case, the view model Pokemon posts, which is an array of stuff, array of posts, and those get reflected and displayed in our UI. Now, this row view that I've created is smaller. It looks more like a row, but whether it's small or big doesn't matter if it's a row, right? Whether the row takes up the whole screen like it does in Instagram, or whether it's small like in this sample app, it doesn't matter. It's still just a row. The difference, though, is if we want to be able to tap on a row and go to a detail view. In Instagram, that wasn't really required, so we didn't do that. But maybe in this application and many other applications, you would want to do that. So how do we do this? As we discussed, there are 2 ways, either navigation stack or navigation split view. In this one, we're going to look at navigation stack. It's the simpler of the 2, and so we're going to start with this one, right? So navigation stack just allows for one column, but allows navigation. So you can see our list is already one column, and now we need some kind of navigation. That also means we need a third view, right? So we have this view, which is up here, right, is the list. And then inside the list there's a row, but there's also going to need to be some kind of detail view, you might call it, which when you tap on a row, it's going to go to that detail view. Now I've already created one of those views. we're not going to get into that. We're going to see how they combine, but it's the same idea. Just as you've created a Pokemon row view, we would create a Pokemon detail view. And it's exactly the same idea. You give it a post and you pass it in. And in fact, I could replace instead of, right? And now we see my rows look different. They look more like the Instagram kind of a thing. So the views are interchangeable, and it's up to you to decide what they are. For clarity, I just named this one detail and this one row because that's how I intend to use it. But of course, you can name this how you like. So, okay, now I have the detail in my list, but that's not what I want, right? We want to be able to tap on a row and then view a detail in full screen. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is our list needs to be wrapped inside a navigation stack. And we're just going to use the basic form of the navigation stack. We're not going to use this path or route, at least not yet. And you add it like that, right? It looks sort of like an H stack or V stack, and that's the idea, but this is a navigation stack. So it's not affecting the visual interface, it's affecting the logic of how you navigate the views inside of it. So anything you put inside of here will be within this logic of navigating. And so we want to put our list inside of it. So we have our list inside a navigation stack, but we're not done. This alone doesn't work. It's still, nothing has changed because we need that detail view, right? We need a way to connect when they tap on a row to go to the corresponding detail view. And so in order to do that, we wrap our row in something called a navigation link. Now, there are a couple of ways to do a navigation link. And this value one, that's the programmatic navigation. That's a little more complicated, and we'll talk about that later. But I want to show you the simplest version, which uses the views directly. And that's this one that has destination and label. And so you can see it's telling me, well, the destination is those open close parentheses is a closure, and the arrow is returning a view. So it's something that returns a view. And the label is also something that returns a view. So let's press enter. And you'll notice it kind of has this blue fill in. You might get an error because it doesn't know what's going on. Well, as long as the blue is highlighted and you press enter again, it auto-completes the shorthand. This is the shorthand, and now we can see we have a navigation link. And so this first one is where the detail view should go. And the second one is the label, which the label is the row view. And this closure is just expecting something that conforms to a view, which, good thing, every time we create a view, right, it's some view. The body is some view, which is required by SwiftUI view protocol. So all of our views are some kind of view. And this is good. That means our row view that we've already created, we can just move that and put it in the label, and that will work. And this navigation link, it's hidden. There's shorthand here that's not explicitly said, but this is where the detail view goes. And so we just type Pokemon detail, and again we pass the post. So let's wait. The errors should go away. They have. And now if we look at our preview, it looks almost the same, but there's a small, subtle difference. There's a visual difference that now that we add this link. Do you see it? It's on the right. So now there's this little chevron arrow. So next to Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, etc., there's this arrow because SwiftUI has figured out what we intend, and there is now a link between each row and each detail. And that's what this is. So this navigation link is connecting this row to this detail. And it's all inside the navigation stack, which happens to be inside the list. Well, the list is inside the navigation stack. So that means if we tap on Bulbasaur, we get Bulbasaur. But if we tap on Charmander, we get Charmander. If we scroll all the way down, get Ash's Pikachu, we get Ash's Pikachu. So you can see this is a very elegant, simple way to create complex interfaces with complex data. You can see our view has a lot going on with a lot of different objects. And if we tap on it, we just get what we expect. And this is all handled with only like 5 lines of code. And it's because this navigation link is connecting our row to our detail view. This is inside each item in the list, which is coming from our data, and that's all wrapped in a navigation stack. And if you're curious, well, what does the detail view look like? It's just like any other view. In fact, you've already seen this one because I just reused it. In the past, I used it as a row, and all I did was rename it to call it detail so that it was clear of how I intended to use it. But you've already seen this view. It has an image, an H stack, all embedded in a Z stack to create this kind of layout that I wanted. And our row view is the same. Right? It's an H stack, some other things, and the one interesting thing is that I force the height to be 80. That's sort of an average row height. So there is one fixed sort of thing here in the row to create the desired layout. So these can be whatever you like, right? However you want it. And the important thing to be consistent is they each take a post. Like they should each take the same kind of data, and they should only need one of that kind of data. And then you can just fill out what it needs to be within that thing. You might need access to a view model, right, in here, but that would be a shared environment object. That would be a shared one, but the only unique thing is the post, and it should be the same so that the row takes a post and the detail also takes a post. Right, and you can see in this one I do also have the view model. So that's really all there is to a navigation stack. Let's now take a look at navigation split view. Here's where we left off. We have our navigation stack, a list of things, navigation link that connects the row to the detail. And let's see, what about the navigation split view? How does that work? Well, one change I've made is the preview on the right is now an iPad. And I just did that so that you can more easily see the difference. It becomes more apparent quicker. Of course, there is a difference on the iPhone as well. As we discussed, you tap through the columns. But on the iPad, you can see multiple columns at once. So that's helpful to show as I program. So it's just where we left off, but now the iPad is the preview. So how do we make this work with a navigation split view instead of a navigation stack? Well, let's look at what a navigation split view is. We can see there are many different ways to define a navigation split view, right? These are different initializers. That's when you see multiple options, that's what that means for any struct or class or object or whatever. And now these are something else, split view visibility and such, keeps going. But at the top, now we split view there, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 initializers. And there's something, the most complicated is column visibility, sidebar, content detail. Then we still have column visibility, but we lose content. This one, we gain content, but we lose column visibility. And this one, the simplest of them all, just as a sidebar and just as a detail. And this is what we want. We just want a simple thing that when we use an iPad, it takes advantage of multiple columns so we could see our list, Pokemon on the left, and then see the detail view on the right. So it'll be very similar to our stack. In fact, on the iPhone, it'll be exactly the same, but on the iPad, we will use the screen space a little better. So this would be a nice improvement to our application. So let's go ahead and press enter and see what that's like. So again, we have these closures. That is something that conforms to a view, and we're used to seeing this because it's a common pattern in SwiftUI. And if we press enter on the little blue part again, it's going to autocomplete the shorthand, which just gives us the closures. And we have these code blocks which need to be filled in. Since they're not filled in, we get all these errors, but that's fine. It's just because there's nothing here yet. And basically, the easiest way to convert this into a split view is actually to just copy the list, right? All the stuff inside the navigation stack. If we just move that in the split view, it will actually just work. And the detail, in this case, there's a special little thing hanging for the detail. But we actually already have the detail connected via our navigation link. And because we have that, let's get rid of the code placeholder, and so we'll just leave that as an empty closure. And we don't need this other navigation stack anymore, so let's get rid of that. So if we just run it like that, this works because now we're inside the navigation split view. We still have our list, and the link connects our row to our detail. But what happened on our preview? Everything disappeared. Well, when the iPad is in portrait mode, the default is to hide the side view. So this little button showed up though, and if we tap that, then we can see, there's our list. And so if we tap, we can indeed see the full detail view. And so now we're getting that better use of the screen space. And indeed, if we rotate the device, you can see that both stay visible on the screen. And this is really the effect that we wanted. And this is sort of an improvement over the previous, right? So now this works better on iPad, but it still works the same as we'd expect on iPhone. Now, let me show you a few ways to improve this. One thing you notice is there's no titles anywhere. And this works the same whether you're navigation split view or navigation stack. I'm just going to show it to you now. So when you have your list, right, which we'll get rid of that extra space, this closure is sort of the closing of our list. So whatever object is inside your navigation split view or navigation stack, you can add something called a navigation title. So you add it to the object inside of the split view or the stack, but the title will then be displayed sort of on the built-in header and table view and things that Apple creates as part of navigation split view or navigation stack. And so in this case, I might just call it Pokemon. Yeah, and so you can see that the title has appeared here on the left, and that's kind of nice. Now when we tap here to our detail view, maybe we want a title to show up there. Right where it is, we can add a navigation title, and we'll call it post Pokemon display name. So now it's nice, you notice that we have Pokemon on the left, but we have Bulbasaur on the right. And so the title changes dynamically with each object. And that's what we want. And again, it might be easier to add this title here. You could also, if you wanted, we could add this inside the detail view. But if you do it inside the detail view, you want to remember, like add it to the root of the view. So it would be right here after the padding at the very bottom. And you could add it here. Now, if we let it refresh, you can see the title is still here. So you can decide which makes more sense to you. I sometimes find putting it in the detail itself can be confusing because maybe you use this view outside of a navigation link or something like that. And as you saw, it's sort of just at the end of this very long thing. So I like to keep all the navigation things together. So I probably would not put it there, and I would leave it as it was, the first time, and just leave it here. So that's navigation titles, both for like the parent, which this can be a split view or a stack, and you have it there, and then the dynamic title for the selected row. And this is what's nice about using these objects, this array of things that we pass around, is you can use it in multiple places like that. Okay, but what about this detail view and it's just sort of empty, and why is that there? Well, this gets into the programmatic navigation. And so to really take advantage of navigation split view, including like if you wanted 3 columns, right? We just have 2 here, but you can have 3 columns. And other things, you would do something called programmatic navigation. And it requires a little extra writing and thinking about things. But the main idea is instead of passing a view, like this detail, which is a view, right? We just think about what object we pass to the detail view, which in this case is a post. So let me walk through it to explain what I mean. It's a little hard to sort of grasp. Essentially what we would do is this detail view that has a navigation title attached to it, we would not put it there, we would put it here. And so now we always know that there is a detail view that, will go to this thing. But you'll notice it says, hey, we cannot find post in this scope. Like, where are you getting this post? Because before we got the post from our list of posts, and it was doing a nice job of, filtering from the array one by one and all that. So how do we get this one post that we want? Well, turns out that list has another thing called selection. And you may remember when I demonstrated the tab view, it also has a selection parameter. And so this is the beginning of programmatic navigation. You can use it with a tab view, with a navigation stack, or in this case, you can use it with a navigation split view. Now, but it's part of the list and it's part of the tab view, but they all sort of work together, depending how you would do it. So here we have the selection on our list. And what it's saying is it's saying when I select something in the list, let me save that state, that selection data, to some other variable, which means we need to create a variable for it to save that state. And you can see it wants a binding set to that variable, which means we need to create some variable for our selected post. But not only that, it needs to be a state variable. And it's just a struct, which is why it's a state, right? Not a state object, which is fine, because we just want one post that we're going to hold on to, which is the selected post when a user selects one from this list. All right, so it is going to be type post. But the thing here is the user may select a post, right? But they may not select any post at all. And so if they haven't selected a post, there is no selected post, right? When the app first launches. And so this is called an optional. Haven't talked a lot about optionals before. Originally, I was going to talk more about them in the networking section, but we will just talk about them here. And optionals are a way to tell Swift that, maybe there will be a thing or maybe there won't be a thing. So in this case, this is a post, but it's an optional post. And adding this question mark at the end is how you mark it as optional. So this is saying there might be a post here or there might be nothing. And since it's an optional, we don't need to give it a default value, right? Normally when you have state, because this is a source of truth, you would have to give it a default value of some post or something like that. But that's not what we do here. Because it's optional, even though it is a state object, it doesn't need a initial value, which is good because in our case, we don't know what the user's initial selection would be. We don't want to assume that they would select Pikachu first or Bulbasaur, Charmander, whatever. That would be the wrong approach. So we don't know what it is, and that's why an optional is a good use here. And what's nice is the selection that the list works with, it can work with optional state variables. So to create the binding, we will add the $, and then we'll say selected post. And so now, when the user picks something in the list, whatever whichever post that they have chosen gets saved in this little state, which is helpful because now we can use it in other places. And for example, the other places is in this detail. So now, to do this binding from the row to the detail, we want the selected post. That's the post that we want, right? So now this detail can use that selected post. Except wait a minute, there's a problem. Our detail doesn't know what to do with an optional. We assume you always have a post. We don't know what to do with this thing of there might be a post, there might not be a post. How do we handle this? And so our error is saying, hey, you have an optional post. It must be unwrapped to the actual type post if you want to use it here. If not, maybe, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could force unwrap it. So what do we want to do? Well, we don't want to do any of their suggestions in this case. Other times these suggestions are fine, but not in this case. So what we want to do is we want to say if the post is actually there. And how we do that is we say if let. We say if let post equals selected post, then we're going to do some stuff. So this is saying if that selected post is an actual post, we're going to do stuff inside of here. And we could rename this whatever we want. We could use the same name, like we could say if selected post equals selected post, or something else. In this case, it's helpful to use a shorter name, post. And now we can put this detail view inside of this if let statement. And we want to go back to using just post. And this makes it a little more readable as well, a little simpler. So now we're saying, all right, this optional thing, if it's an actual post, then we do our detail view just like we normally did. And that's all good, but what about the else, right? What about if this is nothing, if there is no selected post? Well, think about it. If the user hasn't selected anything, what do we want to tell them? We want to tell them they should select. Remember when the iPad was in portrait? We can change it. It's just this blank screen. That's not very helpful to the user. And so what would be nice is some kind of view that tells the user, hey, they should select something. Well, and you could get, very elaborate in this, but the simplest is just to use text. Because if you remember, text is a view itself. And so we could just say, please select a Pokemon post. So now you can see the preview's already updated, and if the user has not picked anything, they haven't selected anything, we get this little text that tells them what to do. And now they can tap up here and we can tap. Oh, and it still doesn't work. So why doesn't it work? So the reason it doesn't work is because this navigation link is still expecting some kind of detail to go in here. It's expecting a Pokemon detail sort of a thing. But that's not what we want anymore, because now our detail is down here and we're using our selection with our selected state. So how do we get this navigation link to kind of work with the rest of these things? Well, this is that programmatic version of navigation link. And if you remember, so instead of using the destination label, we use this value label. And so the value is the thing that's connected to the selection that works with this programmatic navigation. So if we use that one, and in this case, it just wants something that's hashable. And don't worry about what that is right now, but it just needs some kind of object. And then it will have a view that is the label that is our preview. And so if we press enter, we get the shorthand that looks like this. So that means our label, our row view, we would move that up here. And we need some kind of value. Well, the value is the post, right? And so I've made sure that post is hashable in my data model. And so that is the thing that we want to put here. And by putting that there, it connects this link with the selected post and connects it with this detail down here. So we say post, put that in there. And we don't need this other version of navigation link anymore. So we get rid of that. And so now we have our programmatic navigation link with our programmatic selection, and then the navigation split view, which uses detail, and it expects sort of a programmatic implementation of your detail. And you can see it lets us get a little more dynamic whether they've selected or not, right? This way to control and show if they haven't selected anything, you can't do that without programmatic navigation. So this is helpful, but it is a little more complicated to set up. And let's just make sure that this does work. So we'll tap here, and great. We can see that the selection is updated. We can see that I have my navigation title, right, is working. And so everything is working as it was before, just now with the programmatic navigation way, which just gives us a little more control, a little more flexibility. And that's all I'm going to share about programmatic navigation. There is a lot more to it, though. If you're wondering, you're like, okay, it's cool to be able to show this, text if they haven't selected anything, but is that really it? Well, no, there's more to it, and in larger, complicated apps, it really is quite beneficial. For example, if you wanted to jump to a specific view, when it's programmatic, you can do that quite easily because you can access the array of posts. But I'm not going to get into that. It's a little bit outside the scope. If in your final project you have questions about that, ask me. But I think just this basic general is a good starting point for everyone. So that is programmatic navigation with navigation split view.